Thank you. The direct is to Matt and to others in the room. I think Dr. Jones mentioned this development in her comments earlier, that there's legislation pending to protect African American grave sites. And I've heard it's at a critical juncture, so we might plug this and tell people it's time to call their representatives. And like, do you have a sense of how much that would have helped to combat many of these events?
Yeah, that's so. The opponents of the. Is this working?
I don't think it's on.
Maybe I just have to look it up.
So you want this one?
Oh, there you go. Okay. So Montgomery County tried to remedy this with a new cemetery protection law that basically strengthened available protections. They made the whole process a little bit more proactive. They created a mechanism to expand the list of known cemeteries, and it wouldn't have done anything to help Moses Cemetery. The only thing that stopped it from being, and I know you're talking about the national law, and I'm kind of the wrong person to comment on that. At least I don't have on the top of my head a statement prepared, But what, at these rallies, the opening line was, we want a museum, and we want the land back. And I don't know that that's what we're talking about with the national network. Really, so now Montgomery County owns the land, or they hold the land. Hold it these days. Might be theirs. Sorry, Alex yesterday talking sort of confused me about that. Whether the county really does own it or not, but they think they own it and they have plans for it. And county governments are pretty patient, and so this is an ongoing struggle, and I don't know enough to relate it to the question that you're asking, or maybe
Well, was Dr. Jones here? Do you have a?
No, she had to go.
Yeah. So my knowledge, and Paul, correct me, you've been very much following this and instrumental in the Society for Historical Archaeology was involved in helping to build this bill. But there's now pending in the House of Representatives an act that would, in the first phase, if you're familiar with the National Park Service's Network for Freedom, where you designate sites and get them mapped, and says this was a house that was a safe house in the escape routes of the Underground Railroad, that mechanism is designed to put people on notice. This is an important, distinctive place. It shouldn't be bulldozed and a shopping mall put into place with it. It doesn't have immediate legal effect, but it's raising the consciousness in a very palpable way. And the pending legislation focused purely on African American burial grounds would have a first phase doing the same thing, create a national website where people can map these and give higher prominence and visibility to them. And so that's pending now, so if you have some free time, call your congressperson, tell them they should vote yes on this pending legislation. But it's very much been formulated in a stepwise, incremental approach, so that just having noticed that so many of your stories was notice didn't get you very far. You really need to have other ways to fight it.
And I know, so Dr. Blakey's also been sort of taking, he was involved with the River Road Moses Cemetery, and he's been speaking about these situations as well. He often ends with a comment about the national legislation as a measure of progress. That it's getting somewhere, the message is happening, the message is getting out, I should say.
I think we just need to acknowledge that Mark Mack was the one who really, I'm sorry, I can't forget Mark Mack, who really tried his best to move this forward for the protection of African American cemeteries, especially in urban centers. Unfortunately, Mark Mack was taken from us and he died before this could happen, but I just wanted to acknowledge his name because it's very important in the process.
Thank you.
No, I just was crying. I'm back.
This question is, I guess, mostly for Paul and Allison, but perhaps Matt, you have some thoughts on this too. both of you described a situation where there were dominant kind of narratives that are told in the communities that you work with that don't necessarily line up with your research in terms of what the documentary and material evidence in your analysis might suggest about those people in the past. And I wondered, how do you respond to that? And how do you respond to that when stories that are told about the that are important to people about the communities that you work with don't necessarily match up to what you found in your research? In terms of your interactions with the community, I should say.
I complain about it. I complain about it a lot. I write about it. So in my case, we, meaning me and the co-thinkers that are part of my research projects, we are constantly coming up against individuals who are in positions of power, who want to control the way story is told in their neighborhood, and they want to do that through historic preservation, local regulation. And so when new narratives, which aren't really new, right, but they're new to the people who control the way the narrative is constructed, when those come up, there's certain people that shut down, and we have to still be able to negotiate relationships with those individuals in power. So it's really tricky. But, you can't be silent about it. And there's a lot of feedback on this. It's kind of bothering.
I know this is not an easy question, and it.
No, it is easy. Actually, it's very easy.
Okay. Thank you.
I could care less what preservationists want to do. To be honest, it's privileged stakeholders. It's the voices of dissenting community and the people that matter. What they want to do, those are the folks that I serve primarily. Those are the people I want to serve primarily.
And what if the narratives of that community that you want to serve, and maybe this hasn't happened to you, but what if the narratives of that community that you want to serve don't align with the research that you've done?
Oh, wow.
They rarely align, actually. That's a human relationship, scholars and engaged communities. If you have faith and trust in each other, you could work through those sorts of things. I have not that level of faith and trust with preservationists anywhere in Maryland.
Safe for me.
Enough said.
Not taking it.
Not much to say after that.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions,
Actually, I do.
yeah.
Matt, can you actually give us some insight on how preservation and archaeology intersect in Washington, D.C. as it relates to the fact that D.C. is actually not a state? And so how does the sort of laws overseeing it being considered a territory impact archaeology and efforts to use to preserve?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So the structure of there's a preservation apparatus in DC, but the structure of city government is a little different, so it's closer to it's just organized differently from how it would be in a county, or sheriff's office. But one thing that I kind of appreciate, I almost always am working under local jurisdictions and not, Section 106 or NEPA. And the personalities of the people involved mean a lot, and their sort of energy and interests. And DC happens to have a dynamite city archaeologist, a woman named Ruth Spicoli, who is just tireless and also really, you'll submit a report and she'll work you over to make sure you get it right. And actually, from start to finish, in your work plan, she'll work you over to make sure you get it right, that you include public interpretation not just to talk, but sort of along different routes, and that the developer knows that the developer understands that there has to be budget for that. And the preservation work I know less about, except that they can be pretty effective in that area as well, I guess. And this is a separate example, but I worked with a church called the Emory Church that was trying to redevelop the church property. The church property happened to fall on a portion of Civil War Fort Stevens. So this is basically the focus of Jubal Early's attack on Washington, and Lincoln was shot at Fort Stevens. And opponents of that project were able to get their church on the National Register within like a year, as an attempt to forestall the redevelopment of the property. They redeveloped it anyway. But to me, that speaks to their effectiveness. Is that approaching the?
It is, but I was asking the question because Washington D.C. continues to be in the midst of heavy urban revitalization and gentrification. And Ruth has been the city archaeologist for many, many years, and you're right, has worked tirelessly. But it seems like this is what you were describing in Maryland would have a really, really big effect on many of the Black communities in DC that are literally hanging on by a thread. Even right now, as we speak, I just think about the Shaw neighborhood, which the Shaw, Howard, and U Street neighborhood, those were areas that were gentrified even long before, almost a decade ago. And so I was just curious about how any type of state, federal, or whatever legislation was in place to protect, African American history and archaeology in DC. In light of the current moment.
I know she's had to sort of stand by and witness a part of the Berry Farm neighborhood. Berry Farm was basically a town set up, not a town, but a subdivision set up for freedmen. And these people who would work a job all day and then go home and build their house at night. Anyways, a small part of that is being designated, but most of it is coming down or being redeveloped. And she's had a little bit of access to sort of carry out investigations beforehand, but not enough. And what she has there are a number of people who've worked in her office who've taken the little bit of data from Berry Farm and done great things with it, and it kind of demonstrates a lot of promise that isn't going to be realized. It's difficult to control. And I kind of made it sound as though, as though Prince George's County could control development, and they can't either. They are. It's not fair to the people who do this work to say they check boxes, but that's about what they can do. It's a downer answer. You deserve a better answer about how things work in DC. I'm just unfortunately not prepared to spell out like that.
Thank you.
One more question. Where's this?
To Allison and others, but my background is more above ground architecture, decorative arts. But one of the things that you mentioned was depression and how advantageous it is, long periods of depression in an economic way, to preserving the above ground architecture. I would think that would be also true for archaeological studies. So the great opportunities would seem to me to find those places that are currently depressed and to take advantage of the opportunities there. I wonder what you have in terms of comments on that.
Right. Well, so the areas that I talked about today are no longer economically depressed.
So now they're booming.
Right. And so the opportunities for archaeology really only come up in situations where they're dictated by environmental review. Okay. hopefully that's happening on the local level, but oftentimes that's not. Which is one of the reasons why preservation of sands was so important in Sag Harbor. So it's right next to Eastville, which it was already listed on the National Register, and even with that listing, and even with archaeological code written into the village code, houses were being torn down with little regard for documentation of the building and the archaeological deposits that were associated with them. So that was happening. At the same time, I guess, at the same time, we had people with an exorbitant amount of money coming in to buy up properties that seemed really relatively cheap compared to the actual value of the property. And that's what was happening in Sands, right east of Eastville. Okay, so you had all of these basically mid-century homes that were constructed starting in the 1940s and right up to the 1970s by middle and upper middle class blacks who had money to be able to purchase vacation homes. And they stayed in families for sometimes several generations, but eventually some people stopped coming. So those houses looked vacant or empty. And those were the perfect opportunities for people with tons of money to come in and purchase a home where, you know, the descendants hadn't been there in maybe 20 years, didn't know what the true value of the property was because they don't live in the area anymore. You know, you have a speculator who comes in and offers $600,000 cash for a property that is a multi-million-dollar property. You know, and so in that sense, like that sense of development that you can't stop because the amount of money that's being brought into the village is really what sparked the interest of residents in preserving the legacy and the history of their neighborhood. And they sought to do that through National Register listing. So the neighborhood is fairly contemporary but historic enough that it meets the National Register deadline, you know, the National Register criteria. We're still figuring out potential for archaeology, but from what we understand, there's very little that was happening there before Sands was platted and sold specifically for people of color. You know, it was wooded, it was marshy. You can still see some of the trails that you know that cut through different parts of the neighborhood, and people complained about it in the newspaper, in the newspaper and in like local politics about how nothing was happening with that property. So when Amazingly Meredith and Maud Terry approached Daniel Gale's mother, they said, "We're really interested in this property," and Gale couldn't do anything with it. They couldn't move it. So, you know, that's how the Sands community developed. So at this point now, it's really hard to find those areas that can be investigated archaeologically. In Sands, it's kind of tricky. It's still tied to Eastville, and if we as a community are paying attention to redevelopment in Eastville, you know, if a house is being knocked down, there are people that go to those meetings and they say, hey, this is important, this is significant, and this really needs to be documented before this change happens. And that's like one of the most positive things that comes out of the community activity in Eastville. And we actually have a resident here who's with us today, Donna Marie Barnes. And she can speak to that too, I'm sure. I don't know, does that help?
Okay, well, thank you so much.